This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On November the 17th, our virtual Defense and Security Studies program hosted Darrell Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, and Tom Nichols, professor at the US Naval War College in Rhode Island, who has spent the past year advising the Lincoln Project. The topic, 2 weeks after, implications of the US general election for Canada.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Royal Canadian Military Institute Defense and Security Studies program speaker presentation for November 2020. My name is Dr. Daniel Eustace. I'm the director of the Defense and Security Studies program. And thank you very much for taking the time this evening to join us. I should let you know that the program that you're witnessing is being recorded, which will give you an opportunity to go back and look at it again. And at the same time, let your friends and family know that it's available on the RCMI YouTube station. So lots of opportunities to see this. Tonight's event is a follow-on, really, from the event we ran in October, where we had two very distinguished journalists, Matt Gurney and Justin Ling, who were peering into the future of what might be happening or what might happen in the United States election. And they had some very interesting insights, and we were all learning a great deal from them and thinking about what might happen. Well, guess what? Here we are about 2 weeks after the US election, and we felt that it was very important to take that opportunity to now try and gain a better insight as to what it is that actually has happened, what is happening, and indeed what might happen going forward. So really, that's the focus for tonight. We have the great fortune of having two very distinguished speakers with us tonight. Tom Nichols, who will be the second speaker tonight, is a US Naval War College University professor. He's an adjunct professor at the US Air Force School of Strategic Force Studies and the Harvard Extension School. He's a well-known specialist on Russian affairs, nuclear strategy, NATO, and he's a nationally known commentator on US politics and national security. He was a staff member to the United States Senate, a fellow at CSIS and the Harvard Kennedy School, and previously taught at Dartmouth, LaSalle, and Georgetown. What's also interesting, and in light of what has recently happened, and a great loss to us and the United States, he is also a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion and was noted in the Jeopardy Hall of Fame after his 1994 appearances as one of the all-time best players. He's also a prolific author, and recently I read his latest book, I believe, which is entitled The Death of Expertise. And if you have not had an opportunity to pick that up, I highly recommend that you do. It's tremendously insightful and tremendously relevant to what is going on in the world today. Dr. Darrell Bricker, who is going to be our first speaker tonight, is a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs. He's the global CEO for public affairs at Ipsos Global Affairs. And this is an incredibly important organization that does polling globally on many, many issues. And I think he's going to have an opportunity in a moment to share some of the insights that he and his firm have gleaned as a result of the US election. Darrell holds a PhD in political science from Carleton. He was a Social Science and Humanities Research Council doctoral fellow. He holds a BA and MA from Wilfrid Laurier. He too is a prolific author, and I've read all of his books, but I would certainly recommend to you again his latest publication, known as The Big Shift, written with John Ibbotson, is tremendously insightful, and I've actually referenced it in some of the coursework that I do at the Canadian Forces College to try and get people to understand the impact of global population decline, not increase, going forward and the significance of that. So we've got two incredibly insightful, experienced, and intelligent people on board tonight, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. And I thank Sylvia, by the way, who's sitting here and in charge of the whole event. She does incredible work for us, and I'll come back to Sylvia later on. Eric Morris, I would also like to thank for his suggestion for inviting Darrell and Tom. And thank you very much for that, Eric, and I'll speak to you a little bit later on. But if I may, could I now ask Darrell to take the floor, as it were, the virtual floor, and provide us with some of the insights that your organization has gleaned over the last few weeks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you for the invitation to speak to my fellow colleagues at the RCMI. I miss being at the RCMI very much. And I think one of the very first things I'm going to do when I get a chance to get back out into the world again, as we all get back out into the world, is come back and go to the short bar and have a London Pride. I can hardly wait. But that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. And sometime, I guess, when I am in either the short or the long bar and you want to talk about some of these things, we can explore them a little bit more. But just to give a bit of an introduction to what happened in the American election. Now, first of all, everybody on this call probably knows me as not being an American, but I'm certainly an interested and engaged observer. In Ipsos Public Affairs, where I'm the global CEO, we were very engaged with polling in this election campaign, working mostly for Reuters, but also for ABC News, USA Today. We did some work for 538 and a few Axios we were doing some work for. So we're doing a lot of polling in the United States during this election. And it really was a battle for the soul of America. It was pitched as that by one of the campaigns, and it really turned out to be that way when you take a look at the data. One of the interesting things that we did during the course of the election, and actually pretty recently, is we asked people in 28 countries how they would vote if they were given a chance in the election campaign. Donald Trump only won in Russia, interestingly enough, but he did come close in Turkey and Poland. So what America eventually decided, and by the way, they're still counting votes in the United States, believe it or not, what America decided through the election campaign, the world would have decided as well. They're very much breathing a sigh of relief. They believe that the right side won the battle for America's soul through this election campaign. While that's how the world sees it, those who are watching more closely aren't breathing as easy. This was an election like no other. It was held during a pandemic. We had unprecedented levels of early and non-traditional voting, mostly by mail. A losing candidate now who won't concede and has even questioned the legitimacy of the process. If turnout is any indication, Americans themselves also saw this as an unprecedented battle for their nation's soul. Turnout was 65%. That's the highest in over 100 years. This compares to just 56% for the presidential election back in 2016. The loser of this election, Donald Trump, got 73 million votes. That's 11 million more than he got in 2016. The winner, Joe Biden, got 79 million votes. That was 13 million more than Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden, in the end, is going to receive more votes than any presidential candidate in American history. Yet, this was a close-fought thing. Estimates are that if only 80,000 votes have flipped in the right states in the right places, Trump could have been reelected. Now, I haven't done that calculation myself. It's something I read in the New York Times today, but it's just a reminder of how the correlation between actually what happens in voting and what happens in an election campaign is sometimes not that close. So even though Joe Biden is going to beat Donald Trump by probably around 6 million votes, just a sliver of that in the right places, about 80,000, would have turned this over to Donald Trump. What's clear is that this was a closely fought election. It was an intense election, and the America that has emerged is very, very divided. A quick scroll through the exit poll data, and if you haven't done it, there's a number of sites. I usually go to the New York Times site to look at the exit poll data. Is shocking. On nearly every issue tested, those who voted for Trump held the opposite opinion to those who voted for Biden. Not by a little, by a lot. I'm talking on many issues where it's 90-10. And then for the other side, 90-10. The place where Americans come together is not obvious when you look at those data. I look at a lot of polling data, and I have done so for 3 decades. I've never seen anything like it. On top of the intense division, there's an oppressive layer of uncertainty right now in public opinion. COVID has made the uncertainty and worry more intense, but it existed prior to the pandemic. Americans are worried about the future and uncertain about how to plan for it. They also have low levels of trust in the institutions they need to lead them through this uncertainty. By the way, Canada shouldn't be smug about this. This isn't just an American problem. There's similar levels of uncertainty and low levels of trust plaguing many Western democracies these days, including Canada. There's a lot I can share on what we learned from polling during the US election, but since this is mostly a Canadian audience and we are virtually at the RCMI, I'd like to spend a minute on foreign policy, defense policy. It's rare that foreign policy plays much of a role in an election campaign. Elections are almost always fought on domestic issues. It's really no different this time. To the extent that policy played into the vote, foreign policy policy at all played into the vote, it has highlighted really a candidate's fitness to lead. So it wasn't necessarily the substance of the policy, it was what it communicated about the fitness of a particular candidate to lead. For those of us who are old enough, this reminded me of the 1988 federal election in Canada that history remembers as being fought over free trade. But free trade was really a platform on which to demonstrate someone's worthiness to lead the country, their fitness to lead the country. It wasn't fought over the substance of free trade. And it's very similar to what we saw in this election in the United States. It was really about the character of the candidates as opposed to any substantive policy issues. To the extent that policy played a role into this, as I said before, it was about a candidate's fitness to lead. If you're focused on COVID, you most likely supported Biden. If you're focused on economic growth, you most likely preferred Trump. But what about foreign policy? In 2016, both trade and immigration were strong parts of Donald Trump's campaign. But little was said about either this time. Border issues did come up, but it was mainly about the humanity of how immigration was being managed by the Trump administration. There was no real serious conversation about building walls or tearing up agreements. It didn't really play that much in the election campaign this time. China as a global protagonist came up a bit, but it was mostly through the lens of COVID. Trump tried to make China an issue early on, but it wasn't sticking. He and his campaign realized the more he spoke about COVID, even in reference to China, the more it raised issues about how he had managed it, which most Americans didn't regard as very positive. For most Americans, Trump was not performing well on COVID, so the more he talked about it, the more the media cycle was on COVID, the worse it was for him. That brought China back to security and trade issues, again, which didn't play very big this time in the election campaign. So what's Biden's foreign policy mandate after the election? Biden honestly played a very little role in the election, and his policies even less. He was mostly a passenger in a car that was being driven by Donald Trump. Trump was the biggest motivator for votes for both his supporters, but also his opponents. We did a big brand study to look at both of the how both the Trump brand and the Biden brands were playing in the election. There was no Biden brand. It was all about reaction to Trump, and which is why he got so much attention, both positive and negative, during the campaign, and Joe Biden got very little. What we do know about Americans and foreign policy, though, is that Trump hit a nerve in 2016 when he spoke about the United States being dragged into what he called bad trade deals and foreign wars. This hasn't gone away with this election. Also, there are significant blocks of Americans who continue to question the US role in multilateral institutions. What happened with the World Health Organization over the last year won't help this. So I would be expecting no 180 from Biden on foreign policy. His margin to maneuver is slim. While we're unlikely to see love-ins with dictators, I don't know that we're necessarily going to see a big shift in terms of the way he manages foreign policy, because American public opinion hasn't shifted enough to give him the base to build from. But leaving aside the presentation issues that really relate to who he decides to sidle up to in terms of the national environment, the need to align American self-interest with foreign policy outcomes is unlikely to subside under Joe Biden, just like it didn't subside under Donald Trump and was in fact highlighted by Donald Trump. So those are my comments. I can turn it over to Tom now for his intro.
Thanks, Darrell. That's all fascinating. Oh, can everybody hear me now? That's all fascinating to me because I'm here, I'm in the middle of the election, but I love to get that granularity. As we were talking before the event, I think pollsters took a needless amount of criticism and vitriol because once again, it looks like the pollsters are actually going to be pretty close to the mark. Let me just echo a few of Daniel's points about policy. I know that in a gathering like this, we love to talk about policy, but I have to tell you that as far as I can tell, this election was not about policy at all. Biden didn't put out a lot of detail about policy, but that's partly because there isn't an American left who doesn't know who Joe Biden is. One of the funniest comments during the campaign was after the first debate when Trump just blew himself up and couldn't stop interrupting, a very young journalist said, that's too bad that Biden couldn't talk more because the voters, there's still a lot the voters want to know and get to know about Joe Biden. And I burst out laughing because Joe Biden's been part of the American political scene for 47 years, including 8 as vice president. There wasn't a lot of mystery about Joe Biden. He was politically the closest thing there could be to comfort food. But it was still interesting the degree to which policy became just a placeholder for a culture war. The kind of issues that Darrell talks about that were 90-10 really were just kind of tribal markers for a lot of people in this election. For example, the issue of free trade and alliances, it's true that Americans still have doubts about that, but most Americans are firmly in favor of open markets, free trade, NATO, our global alliances, and that support actually went up during the Trump administration, which is remarkable. I mean, it was almost as if Trump had said, I'm going to give voice to all of your aggravation and general kind of irritation with the world, and here's what I'm going to do about it. Once people got a good look at that, they said, well, we didn't really mean that. And so the election, to me, was depressing. And if anybody would like to know what I was thinking the night or the morning after the election day, I did a piece in the Atlantic that says it all, that 71 million people still voted for a sociopath. I should add, by the way, I don't represent the US government or the Naval War College or the Lincoln Project or the Air Force or any other institutions I'm with. I was an early adopter of the Never Trump position 5 years ago, and that's still where I am now. So I think the best way to understand the American election from where I'm sitting is that this was a gigantic head-on collision between two American cultures and still a deep sense of resentment. I think that has been the driving emotion between the last two American elections is cultural resentment between the so-called heartland Americans, although really I live in a coastal state and the same folks are here. My state was 60-40 for Biden, but that 40% could just as easily, if you talk to them, it's like talking to somebody from the middle of Indiana. That cultural resentment was really the large driving emotion in this, and that's not going away. But I do think that the cult of Trump is going away. It's remarkable the degree to which the Trump attempt to hold on to the election has collapsed. There are no massive protests in the streets. Nobody's picketing in front of, nobody of any significant size picketing in front of city halls or election stations. Republicans have come to grips with Trump losing. But the one outcome from the election that I want to point out, and then I'm sure we all want to get to questions, so I will try not to take up too much time. The one outcome that I think bears watching over the next 2 years is how badly the Democrats did. Joe Biden did great. Joe Biden clobbered Donald Trump, of course, in the strange American electoral college system where, for those of you that are not familiar with why this is done in the United States, The president is the president of the states. He is not actually the president of the American people. He is the presiding officer chosen by a majority of the states rather than by a majority of the American people. In either way, whether you count by the Electoral College or by the popular vote, Trump got clobbered. The Democrats, on the other hand, did very poorly. There were a lot of split tickets of people who rejected Donald Trump, but then voted down the ticket for Republican government, including in the House of Representatives, where Democrats are struggling to hang on by their fingernails to keep their House majority. I suspect they will lose that House majority in 2022. My sense about this, as a former Republican, now independent, and somebody who argued for voting against the GOP down the line, is that the Democrats are the most undisciplined, least message conscious party I've ever seen. I have never been disappointed by counting on the incompetence of the institutional Democratic Party, and 2020 was no different. That's going to matter, because this was not the repudiation of the entire infrastructure that supported Donald Trump. It was a personal, this is probably why he's taking it so personally, it was a personal and very personal repudiation of Donald Trump. But it was not the wholesale rejection of the Republican Party that I think America needs in order to get back to a more balanced and healthier politics. I think that the people who supported Trump in Republican elected politics needed to lose their seats, and very few of them did. And I think that that is a worrisome sign, because I think it tells you that Americans said, we rejected Trump personally, but we didn't reject a lot of the messages we were hearing, and we haven't rejected this kind of culture war. So we're going to leave the Republicans in there as some kind of counterweight to Joe Biden, even though Joe Biden is probably one of the most centrist Democrats who's been elected to office in years. So that's my quick take on it. As an American observer, I am relieved that Donald Trump is gone. I am apprehensive about the fact that nonetheless a record number of people voted for someone I think is manifestly unfit to be president. And the party balance between Democrats and Republicans, I think, is something that ought to worry all of us. I think from the point of view of foreign policy, it won't matter very much, because the institutional Republicans who've survived they will go back to being, I think, in foreign policy what they were before Donald Trump arrived, which is primarily multilateralists, global supporters of our global alliances, and free traders. They had, that was muted in order to stay on the right side of Donald Trump. But there's good news from what happened on Election Day, but there's a lot to be apprehensive about, unfortunately.
So Tom and Darrell, thanks very much for that. We are going to open up the virtual floor to questions. And Sylvia, I think you can help me out a bit here. They can either do that by the chat method, or they can put up their hand, and I think you're the person that can see that hand. But let me start off, if I may. Tom, one of the things that people were very concerned about going into the election was that there seemed to be this sense that there really could be some literal violence on the streets. And apart from some relatively minor scuffling the other day outside of the White House, that hasn't happened. That's good news. But as this process, whatever this process is that we're going through now towards January 20th, do you think there's the possibility that we're going to actually see more action, as it were, at the street level to try and continue to push these ideas forward, this idea of, fake ballots and all the rest of it that we're seeing in the news? Do you think that's a possibility?
No, and I think there are several reasons for that. First, Donald Trump's demographic, despite what you see on television, is primarily an older demographic. The average Fox viewer is about 68 years old. They're just they're not the type to go into the streets because they're angry. The second reason, excuse me, the second reason is because of the huge geographical sorting of Americans that's taken place. The red states are redder, the blue states are bluer. There are probably some guys in Idaho or Montana that are pretty upset about Trump losing, but they live among people who already agree with them. They are not living, cheek by jowl in South Boston, the way that people did, say, 40 years ago when there was a lot of violence in cities like Boston. They're just not there. The third reason, I think, is that most Americans think the outcome was fair, believe it or not, because of the size of Biden's win, and the Electoral College is doing its job, which is to magnify the victory of the winner. 306 to 232 looks bigger than 78 million to 73 million. But more than that, I think there could have been more violence had Biden won the popular vote and then lost the Electoral College again, because even though I've defended the Electoral College in the past, there are only so many times that America can take that kind of a split outcome. I think millions of Americans would not have accepted the outcome of that election as legitimate. I would have had to grit my teeth and say, within the rules of our constitutional system, it's legitimate, but it feels wrong. And I think, a constitution becomes in danger when people simply stop believing in it over time. So I think had that happened, America would be in the middle of a protracted constitutional crisis right now. And I thank God it didn't happen that way. But we're going to have to do something about the American Electoral College. We can't go on. Even I was saying on election night, with Biden piling up 2, 3, 4 million votes, I said, one candidate shouldn't be 3 million votes ahead, and we're all biting our nails about how the election's going to turn out. That just doesn't make any sense. There's one more reason that I think there hasn't been violence, and that has been the comic opera, staggering incompetence of the Trump team that has been trying to contest this. I mean, when you've got Rudy Giuliani, standing in a parking lot next to a crematorium and a sex toys shop, it just doesn't inspire people to come out in the streets and fly the banners. It's been a real clown car of people defending Trump. Just before we came on tonight, I was checking, I think people might have overheard me, I was checking the court cases where judges are practically personally humiliating Trump's lawyers in court with the kind of questions they're asking and saying things like, why are you here? Why am I listening to this? What are you doing here? And so, if this were another Florida situation where the country was hanging in the balance based on, 500 votes somewhere in the panhandle of Florida, it's possible that there could have been more. But I think for a lot of reasons, age, sorting, the clownishness of the people involved, the size of Biden's popular vote, I just don't think we're going to see much more of that. I'll stop here. The only thing that could change that, I think, is if Trump launches some kind of military action in the next 60 days, and which I think will bring protesters into the streets of various stripes, not just of the left wing, but saddling Joe Biden with a war on his way out the door. I don't think that's going to happen, but I have to admit that I was pretty startled to hear that, days ago, Trump is asking about options on Iran. But I think, especially with his own Department of Homeland Security certifying this as a clean, safe election, and I think that is to the great credit of the American government and the American people, that after sustained attacks by the Russians and others, that we pulled off this election. I'm just not expecting it. And speaking of DHS, just a few minutes ago, while we were sitting here, Trump fired the head of cybersecurity at DHS for contradicting him about the election, which tells you that the election was probably pretty clean.
Thanks, Tom. So Darrell, as a pollster, you probably won't be surprised at the question that has been posed by Tom Laurie, which has to do with getting it right. His question is, did Ipsos get it right, or are you going to fall on your sword? especially in the Senate races. What's your response to Tom?
We didn't poll in the Senate races, so I can put my sword, which is sitting in this cabinet over here, safely in its sheath. What our analysis of what was going on was a combination of polling, but a lot of other insight as well. And what we were saying quite publicly, you can go on our website, it's there if you want to check it, was that this was a very close election. If we had to give probabilities to, we had three scenarios that were possible. The most probable scenario we saw as a close Joe Biden victory, a tight Joe Biden victory. And we gave a 50% probability to that. We gave a 30% probability to a close Donald Trump victory. And then we gave a 20% probability to potential for a Joe Biden blowout. So where I don't understand how people were thinking that there was a huge lead by Joe Biden in the campaign. Our last poll had Joe Biden ahead by 7. When the counting of the votes is all done, and I kept saying to people on election night, when the counting of the ballots is all done, it's probably going to win by somewhere between 4 and 5. So systematically underrepresented Trump by maybe 2 points nationwide, but in just about every state where we were doing polling, we actually got the winner right. We may not have got the magnitude of the size of Joe Biden's victory right, but very close. As far as the polling industry is concerned, not that I need to defend everybody in the polling industry, if you looked at the average of polls, so Real Clear Politics is a good place to look at, or 538 is another good place to look at it. The last estimate for what was going to happen was that the Joe Biden was going to win the popular vote by about 7%. And that the battleground states, so the ones that were most contentious, Biden had about a 2.6% lead. That's actually pretty close to what happened. It may not have looked like that on election night. And again, I just have to remind people in American elections, they take a long time to count votes, particularly for the Democrats, particularly from places like California and New York, where there's a lot of ballots that's to still come in. They may not actually affect the actual outcome, but they have an impact on what that gap is between the two top parties. So actually, when you take a look at the polling, there were some issues. Florida was definitely an issue for everybody. In particular, Miami-Dade and Cuban voters, we still have to figure out a way to get that successful. A couple other states, Maine, where we didn't poll, obviously there were some issues there. We had the gaps in a number of states between Biden and Trump a little wider than what it was, but the actual prediction of who was going to win was pretty much correct. And as I said to Tom at the start of this, and I think he pretty much agreed with me, if I would have offered you the option 2 weeks out of saying, I can tell you who's going to win within about 3%, and I can give you 45 of the 50 states, would you take it? And the answer is most people probably would. And that's pretty much what happened when it came to the polling in the election. So on the night of, I think that there were a few people panicking. It was a little nerve-wracking, I will say. But as we go on through and we actually count what happened in terms of the votes, it's actually going to end up being reasonably close. There are some issues, though. Again, we did underestimate Trump by a couple of points.
Thanks, Darrell. Tom, there seems to be a lot of interest in the US electoral structure itself in terms of the electoral college, the fact that people need to declare themselves as Democrats or Republicans, evidently, to vote. Questions around messaging, the ability of the two parties to get messages across to their base. An example being the fact that I believe in some cases there are candidates on the Republican side who have openly declared themselves as supporters of QAnon, which was one of the subjects that was discussed back in October. Do you think that this election represents some kind of a watershed in terms of the fact that perhaps the United States needs to look at the whole structural means by which they elect a president? And is there any appetite to do that? Or is this a question of, okay, we won this time and they lost, and so the system, it'll just carry on without any significant change?
There's not a huge mandate to do it because the Democrats, because it was so close and because so many members of the House on the Democratic side lost. The Democrats are the ones primarily who want to change things like the Electoral College, and they just took a pounding. So, the Republicans aren't going to throw them a lifeline and say, let's change the Electoral College. So don't count on that changing anytime soon. The only way that can change at the federal level, well, there's one of two ways. One is by constitutional amendment, which isn't going to happen because small states like mine are never going to agree to vote themselves into irrelevance. The other way that is more possible down the line is expanding the size of the House of Representatives or apportioning electors by congressional districts instead of winner take all, which is how Nebraska and Maine already do it. Those are possibilities, but I think people, particularly on the American left, who count on that need to get over it. They need to, it's fine to agitate for it. It's fine to write the position papers and the proposals, but every 2 years, until those changes happen, they're going to have to win by the rules of the Constitution that are in place, not the Constitution they wish existed. I also want to clear up one error in that question. You don't have to register as a Democrat or a Republican to vote in the United States. That is factually incorrect. Now, in some states, and it varies state by state, to vote in the party primary for a presidential candidate, you have to declare yourself a member of one party or the other. Some states have open primaries. Some states have what are called closed primaries, where to get a Republican ballot, for example, you have to be a member of the Republican. You have to say, I prefer a Republican ballot, which then registers you as a Republican in that state. I have never voluntarily registered as a Democrat, and yet for a time I was a registered Democrat because I wanted to vote in the Rhode Island Democratic gubernatorial primary, and I asked for a Democratic ballot. It's that simple in most places. So the parties do not have any existence in the American Constitution or in American law. That is purely, they are private entities. And actually part of my frustration with the Republican Party is that I think they should have excluded Donald Trump from their primaries and from their debates, which they can do. There is no, just because Donald Trump was starting to drag in some Republican votes. David Duke was winning Republican votes in Louisiana in 1991, and the Republicans said, you are not welcome in our party or at our events. So I think that's important to understand, that the parties in America are not public utilities where you have to join them in order to vote. As far as the reform of the Electoral College goes, the people that just won a lot of seats, even though they lost the White House, have a vested interest in fighting those reforms. So I wouldn't look for that anytime soon.
Thanks, Tom. So Darrell, are there any lessons in any of this for Canada? I guess in the short run, and in the long run, one of the things we talk about when we talk about Canada-U.S. relations with my students at the Canadian Forces College is my view is always that there's a great deal of what I would call elasticity in the relationship between Canada and the U.S. And sometimes the elastic gets stretched very far and looks very tense, like it might even break, and then things seem to ease off and the tensions seem to reduce. Is that really what we're seeing right now? Do you think with the Biden presidency that elastic is going to become more relaxed and we'll go back to a, quote, more normal type of relationship? Or is something potentially fundamentally broken in terms of what Tom has described as those two very different cultures, which is going to have a long-lasting impact? Those cultures may well have been there and probably were there, but Donald Trump perhaps was the catalyst to bring those out into the open. Do you think that there's some fundamental change now that is going to happen between Canada and the United States as a result of all of this?
Well, there's two parts to that. One of them is relative to political culture, and then the other one is the relationship between Canada and the United States. So the easiest one to deal with is, I think, the relationship between Canada and the United States. By and large, American policymakers don't think a lot about Canada. It's not a big priority for them. I would expect stylistically that things will improve, that it'll be a warmer situation. I expect the invitation at some point that the House of Commons issued for the president-elect and vice president-elect to come to Canada at some point. They'll likely do it because stylistically it'll be a big love-in. Why wouldn't they? But on matters of substance, we'll see. Like on issues of trade, so far Joe Biden's been talking about Buy America. I mean, you know, there's and even in Canada, we're doing the same thing. I mean, Doug Ford had a big press conference today in which he announced his new procurement system for the government of Ontario and focusing on Canadian suppliers. So I think on issues of substance, that some of those tensions that we saw prior to 1988 are probably going to reemerge in some form or fashion. Again, because nativism and nationalism, I think, has reemerged in politics. The other thing, though, is the actual structure of political culture in the United States and whether it's instructive at all about what's going to happen in Canada or what is happening in Canada. Canada is not the Canada of the 1970s and 80s. It's changed a lot, mostly as a result of the change in our population, which, by the way, is the same thing that's happening in the United States. A lot of what's happening here is not because people have changed their minds. It's that people have changed. Their physical composition has changed. Where they've lived has changed. And as a result of that, what we're seeing is a couple of polarities developing, not just in the United States, but in most Western countries these days. And it's what we're losing is that middle ground governing consensus, that comfortable governing consensus that used to exist. In some ways, Joe Biden is probably one of the last gasps of exactly that. Most of the politics now in the world is, I'm particularly in Western democracies, is becoming more left and more right, and that centerpiece is evaporating. And I would say even in Canada, you referenced the big shift before, that's what the big shift was about. It was about talking about the fact that what was happening was our population composition was changing. More people were living in Western Canada than any time in our history. We have a representation by population system. It created a situation in which it made it, there was new ways to win national elections in the country. And we still think of our country as being the way that it was, and it's changed. And I would say it's a very similar thing in the United States. I mean, you have people who could go back and saying, you know, maybe the 1950s was glorious or the 1970s was glorious. That country is gone. I mean, it's changed forever. And it's the same thing here in Canada. And I would expect in Canada that you're going to see more ideological politics. There's going to be a better defined left. There's going to be a better defined right. That middle ground, that old red Tory, blue liberal area, which I'm sure many people are going to sort of, you know, harumph on the call here and say, well, you know, I'm one of those. You're a very rare beast. In fact, you're like a unicorn now. Most of Canadians aren't in that particular slice of the electoral segment. It's a historical phenomenon. And by the way, they're not decisive in election campaigns anymore either. And the same thing's happening in the United States. It's becoming a more aggressive type of politics in which that middle ground consensus is having a hard time reforming.
Harumph. Tom, I think people would like to have some understanding of what might happen. There's been a few interesting things occur in the last several days. There has been a bit of a purge at the Department of Defense, and then an announcement, I think even today, that President Trump is ordering the withdrawal of troops from Iraq and Afghanistan. There has been discussion, of course, around what will Trump do post presidency, even the consideration of him running again in 2024 as a potential. Do you have any thoughts on what we might see unfold in the next few weeks and even beyond that?
Well, I'll take that in two parts. First, about what's going on at the DoD. I don't think any of us have any clarity about that. I think the most common explanation among my friends and colleagues is there's a lot of score settling going on. That Trump was mad that he was stonewalled by Mark Esper and others, and now he's bringing in, he's doing what Trump does, which is firing people out of sheer spite and bringing in new people. As for the drawdowns, I suspect that was part of how people got him to start firing people, to say, Mr. President, you could have been reelected, but you were slow rolled on great things the American people wanted, and put us in there and we'll get even with all these people. I mean, Trump is incredibly vindictive. He's one of the most vindictive human beings that has ever existed. I mean, he makes Lyndon Johnson look like Mother Teresa. And I'm sure that a big part of this is, let's just put in a bunch of policies, because remember, Donald Trump does not really understand the content of most of his own policies. And he just lets people loose who tell him what he's going to do, what they're going to do. So if someone has pitched this to him as, let's fire all the guys who stonewalled you and cost you the election, and let's start doing things that will aggravate the hell out of everybody in America, and bring the focus back on you as a tough manager, that's probably enough to explain it. I know there was a lot of kind of real paranoid talk about coups and, is this going to be some shadow government? It's always important to remember how completely inept and incompetent all the people around Trump really are. So I'm not worried about that. I am worried about intemperate and stupid actions that the president can take by virtue of still being the Article 2 power of the government right up until January 20th. But even this pullout, I mean, Trump comes in and fires Esper, and he brings in this other guy, says, that's it, everybody's coming home. And then what you get out of it is we're leaving 2,500 people in Afghanistan. We drew down 500. We're still leaving 1,500 in Syria. I don't think any of this means anything other than that this is Trump being Trump, and people are padding their resumes and grabbing positions because, I don't know if it works the same way in Canada, but here in the United States, there's a lot of advantage to say, I'm the former chief of staff in the Pentagon. Even if it was for, as one of my friends who's a very experienced Washington hand says, even if you have to leave in January, you're going to put it on your resume, Pentagon Chief of Staff 2020 to 2021. And it's going to look like you were somebody for 2 months. So I think, never attribute to design and brilliance in this bunch of people what you can better explain through venality and nastiness. As for Trump in 2024, I don't worry about that either. First of all, I think that the president, my personal guess is that the president is in terrible health. I've thought that for years, and that it's been covered up. I don't think he's going to be in any condition to be running in 2024. But even if he were hale and hearty, there's something else to think about. First of all the people that were protecting his secrets for the past 4 years are not going to protect those secrets now. We are going to find out things that are going to curl our hair even worse than what we've learned through Bob Woodward and John Bolton and all the other people. And so, I think part of the reason America got rid of Donald Trump is that we are exhausted by him. And I don't see us getting less exhausted by him. Well, my concept of where Donald Trump goes is that he becomes a kind of a Pat Robertson. For those of you in Canada, Pat Robertson stunned George Bush in 1988. He won the Iowa primaries. He's an evangelical preacher. And then once he was defeated, he became the leader of a popular Christian network that rakes in zillions of dollars. And he's still on television to this day. That might be the path Trump goes. But there's one other thing to consider as well. The Republican Party is full of viciously ambitious people. Ted Cruz, Nikki Haley, Tom Cotton. Those people have been biting their tongue bloody for 4 years. They're not going to sit around for 4 years and say, well, if Donald Trump would like to come back, of course, we'll all put our lives on hold again. We'll all step out of the way again. We'll all watch our donors walk away from us again, and then have to carry his water again for 4 years. there is a institutional block in the Republican Party that wants him to never come back. And I'll say something that I'll end with something that I think will sound odd, given that Trump's people are a cult. And I really do believe that Trump created a cult of personality. But I think that there are a lot of elected Republicans and even a lot of Republican voters who on election night or the day after breathed a huge sigh of relief that they can finally come down off their cross and stop having to live with this guy and defend him. And I think that that is another lesson they're going to take from the big Republican gains that they pulled back from the Democrats after 2018 into 2020. And I still believe that the people who least want to see Donald Trump return in 2024 are institutional Republicans.
Thanks, Tom. So, Darrell, a question for you. I've seen in the Canadian media some criticism around an almost sort of blanket approval of Joe Biden and a blanket condemnation of Donald Trump. In other words, to the point where the media has been, in essence, sort of parroting the left-wing media in the United States. Do you think the media played a significant role in the outcome of this election in terms of what they chose to cover and not cover? There was some last-minute questions around Biden's and his son's involvement in China, for example, which seemed to get virtually no coverage whatsoever. Is that because it was a non-story, or do you think that there was really a purposeful intent to support the Biden campaign over the Trump campaign?
I think just as Tom mentioned, that there's going to be a lot of stories told about. It seems like everybody in the Trump administration will probably have a book contract, so we're going to, hear lots of stories out of what happened with the Trump campaign and also what happened during his administration. I think there's probably going to be a lot of interesting stories told about how the media decided to cover this campaign. Yes, it was pretty clear. Different networks were playing different sides of the different parts of the campaign they preferred. Obviously Fox on the Trump side, but other networks obviously preferring Biden. What I would say that was unique about Donald Trump that he really missed in this election campaign is Donald Trump has a superpower. And his superpower is that he's able to attract television cameras everywhere that he goes. He's able to take over the news cycle. He's able to define the news agenda everywhere he goes. Joe Biden was like a passenger in a car, in the backseat of a car in this election campaign. Everything was about Donald Trump, but in a very different way this time. The last time around, every network chose to cover his rallies, his public appearances from beginning to end, completely dominated the earned media cycle. In fact, his spending on ads, that was the big lesson from the 2016 campaign. If you can earn media, you don't have to spend that much in ads, because Donald Trump didn't actually hardly spend anything on ads. He got it all through media attention. The thing that really hurt Donald Trump's campaign, and I saw somebody else ask this question before, was the COVID virus. If you remove that from what was going on right now, he actually looked like he was in a pretty good position to be reelected. The COVID virus completely did him in terms of the issues that people decided to pay attention to, and also his management of the crisis, which Americans did not agree with. And this includes a large chunk of Republicans, by the way. But I think the thing that really hurt him from a campaigning perspective is he had to campaign with both hands tied behind his back, because until the very end, he wasn't able to do those types of rallies that he really counted on, and really constitute his magical way of interjecting himself into the campaign. And when he was able to get back to doing those rallies at the very end, you actually saw the campaign tighten up. That's when the tightening up took place. So I think what happened was that the media had to change its coverage, mainly because of the coronavirus, even if it would have preferred to change its coverage anyway. But the coronavirus actually gave them the justification, because Trump wasn't able to hold the rallies that he held back in 2016, in my humble view.
Daniel, can I just add one comment about that, which is that I think it's a really interesting counterfactual about, if there had been no COVID, would Donald Trump have been reelected? And I'm still not sure. And, counterfactuals are tough to do, because I mean, he might not have flipped Wisconsin. I think Darrell, Wisconsin might have been shakier, but he's up to something like a 68,000 vote margin in Pennsylvania, which is what he was aiming for. And of course, we're all surprised by Georgia. But the thing about the Hunter Biden stories and, did the media cover for Biden? Joe Biden was one of the most vetted political candidates in American history. And I think part of what happened is, at the end, the American media started to recover its Trump antibodies, of realizing that every nutball story that Trump puts out there doesn't have to be covered. I can't say which outlet it was, but I talked to an American newspaper editor a while back who said, we would be glad to run more pieces that are from people in favor of Donald Trump. She said, but they won't submit to any fact checking at all. She said, we cannot get people who are kind of non-crazy, who will allow us to fact check them. Now, I've written for in this election, past 4 years, I've written for everybody from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and every place in between. If you don't submit to fact checking, they won't take your piece. And I think it tells you something, that at some point the media and the public just said, we're not going to keep chasing these squirrels, these rabbits that the Trump campaign keeps putting out there. So while I don't, as a lifelong conservative, I know that there's a liberal bent in the American media. There's no doubt about it. Fox is still the most watched network, and it has it was practically arguing every day for Trump's reelection. But I think it's not as simple as the media just covered for Joe Biden. A lot of what Trump was putting out there was crazy. And the only other thing I'll say about the COVID rallies, I was on Twitter and social media every day telling people, let Trump be on TV. Put his press conferences on TV, because the rallies may have been helping him. The press conferences were killing him, and his numbers were dropping. His own team finally begged him in April, after the infamous, can you inject bleach and, stick light bulbs down your throat and all that stuff. They tackled him around the legs and said, you have to stop going on television. So I think Biden, Darrell describes it as being in the back of a car. I think it was a classic campaign strategy of not interrupting your opponent while he was hurting himself.
Okay. Well, interesting things on all fronts. Just to satisfy at least one of our attendees, Tom, do you have any comments at all on this whole QAnon thing? Is this important at all? That it seems to be dovetailing into the pandemic, in the sense of it, lines up with anti-maskers and all of these sorts of folks. In your perspective, is this something to be actually concerned about, or are these people, quite frankly, just going to kind of go away when all of this is said and done?
I don't know if they're going to go away. They're going to go on to something else. In the Death of Expertise, I talked about how the collapse of a kind of shared view of reality and what constitutes a fact, and the growth of people's addiction to social media has made everybody, not just in the United States, but I really saw this in Central Europe and a few other places that I traveled over the past few years, has made everybody a lot more vulnerable to conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are the comfort food of a bored, narcissistic society that wants life to be interesting. And that's the problem for a lot of people around the world. Life is too easy. It's too interesting. It's too boring. It's too ordinary. And so, of course, this thing caught fire that we are saving the world from these dangerous pedophiles and these, blood drinking vampires. And I think what's really interesting is that after Election Day, that whole website and channel went silent. And there was just a piece in the New York, I think it was the New York Times, a couple of days ago, that like people in that movement have started to look at each other to say, oh no, were we conned? Have we been had? I think it was a moral panic, kind of like the satanic daycare scandals of 35 years ago. And I don't know how long QAnon will last, but the people who bought that are going to buy the next thing, whatever it is. So that particular nutty conspiracy theory will probably die out, and it will be replaced by some other nutty conspiracy theory. But for how long that lasts, I don't know. I hope that with Trump gone and a kind of return to normalcy, that people start getting back to the idea that daily life is not a gigantic apocalyptic struggle between the forces of good and evil. But as long as there's middle-aged people on the internet, it's going to happen.
That's great. It really is. Dale, are there any last words of wisdom you would like to share with us before we start to sign off on this presentation?
I think it was a very enjoyable experience. A great opportunity to meet Tom and have this conversation. And just thank you to everybody who took the time to sign in tonight.
Thank you, Darrell. We'll be seeing you at the Long Bar. Tom,
Yes.
You're good?
Yes. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
I wish I were with all of you in person, and I'm fascinated by Darrell's work, and I wish we were all at the bar, but hopefully this time next year in Toronto.
Well, you'll certainly have an invitation for sure. That was extremely well done. So yes, please, on behalf of the RCMI and the president, Michael Hoare, who I believe is online, thank you very much for taking the time. I know you're probably both inundated with requests for speaking engagements and whatnot, and I know that our membership certainly has benefited from this, and all the people who will see it online, who are in fact around the world, will benefit from your insights tonight. So thank you very much. I would like to just, I guess, sign off by having our viewers stay tuned for January. We do not typically do presentations, speaker events in December, because it's December, and oh yeah, by the way, there's a pandemic on and it complicates things. But in January, we're going to be having Marcus Kolga, a well-known Russian analyst, talk about Russia and Canada and what's going on there. And Jonathan Manthorpe from the West Coast is going to talk about China. So I'm setting up between January, February, March, April, sort of a bit of an overview of where all the problem sets are existing, how this is interfacing with COVID and what it all means potentially for Canada. So tonight was also a great kickoff to that. So thank you very much. So with that, I'm going to sign off and leave the meeting.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.